Sometimes the most broken souls find their way to us when we least expect it. On this stormy night in Wyoming territory, Jack Monroe, 45 spots, an injured horse limping toward his ranch through the rain. The poor animal keeps looking back at him and nudging toward the old barn. Jack has always believed that animals know things we don't. This horse seems to be asking for help in a way he's never seen before. Something about the way it moves, the way it keeps turning back to make sure he's following. Jack dismounts his Mustang and walks through the storm toward the barn. The horse waits by the wooden doors, whimpering softly. When Jack finally opens those barn doors and steps inside, he discovers something that will change his life forever. But what could be hiding in that old barn that would shock a man who's seen everything the frontier has to offer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm that brought the injured horse to Jack Monroe's doorstep had been building all day across the Wyoming territory. From his kitchen window that morning, Jack had watched the dark clouds gather over the Medicine Bow Mountains, their shadows creeping across the valley like a slow-moving funeral procession. He'd lived on this land for 15 years now, long enough to read the sky like scripture and know when trouble was brewing both in the heavens and in the hearts of men. Jack's ranch sat in a natural bowl of land, protected by rolling hills on 3 sides and bordered by Willow Creek on the 4th. The modest 2-room cabin he'd built with his own hands stood sturdy against the elements, its log walls chinked tight and its roof shingled with cedar he'd split himself. The barn, larger than the house and showing its age with weathered boards and a slight sag to the north wall, housed his 3 horses and what little cattle he kept. It wasn't much by most standards, but it was his, and after the life he'd left behind, ownership of anything felt like a blessing. The hand-carved saddle hanging in his barn told a story Jack rarely shared with anyone. Tooled into the leather were the initials JMMR, surrounded by a border of wild roses, the state flower of his long-lost home in Iowa. He'd carved it himself during the winter of 1863, working by lamplight in a cramped cabin, while the woman he loved slept peacefully nearby. Margaret Rose had been her name, and she'd been everything good in a world that seemed determined to break decent people. The saddle was all he had left of her now, along with memories that both comforted and tormented him during the long, solitary nights. Doc Williams was the closest thing Jack had to a friend in these parts, though their relationship consisted mainly of shared silences and the occasional game of chess. The old physician had arrived in Wyoming territory the same year as Jack, both men carrying the kind of quiet sorrow that spoke of profound loss. Doc had never asked about Jack's past, and Jack had returned the courtesy. Some wounds were too deep for casual conversation, and both men understood the healing power of simply being present without demanding explanations. Sheriff Hayes represented law and order in the territory, though his jurisdiction covered an area so vast that justice often depended on the honor of individual men rather than the swift arrival of a badge. Hayes was a good man, honest and fair, but he was also practical. He knew that in a land where the nearest federal marshal might be 3 days' ride away, sometimes a man had to make his own peace with right and wrong. Jack respected the sheriff, and Hayes had learned to trust Jack's judgment in the rare instances when their paths crossed. The townspeople of Cedar Falls, the nearest settlement some 12 miles south, knew Jack Monroe as a man who kept to himself but could be counted on in times of need. He'd helped pull the Hendersons' wagon out of the mud during last spring's floods, and he'd ridden night watch when rustlers were threatening the Thompson spread. But he never lingered for the thanks or the social gatherings that followed. He did what needed doing, and then returned to his solitude like a ghost, fading back into the wilderness. Jack had chosen isolation deliberately after the war ended, and he'd lost everything that mattered. The badge he'd worn for 8 years as a territorial marshal had felt heavy as lead after Margaret's death, and the weight of other people's problems had become unbearable when he couldn't even solve his own grief. So he'd turned in his star, sold everything he owned, and ridden west until he found this quiet valley where a man could live without explanations or expectations. The war had changed him, as it had changed every man who'd lived through those bloody years. He'd seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes, enough suffering to make him question whether justice was anything more than a pretty word men used to justify their actions. When Margaret died of fever while he was away chasing outlaws, something inside him had simply stopped working. The desire to protect and serve had died with her, buried in the Iowa soil, alongside the only person who'd ever seen past his hard exterior to the gentle soul beneath. But 15 years of quiet living had not erased the skills that had once made him one of the most respected lawmen in the territory. His draw was still lightning quick, though he practiced now only to keep meat on his table. His ability to read men's intentions in their eyes, their posture, the set of their shoulders that remained as sharp as ever. The instincts that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters still whispered warnings when something wasn't right. The injured horse had triggered those instincts the moment Jack spotted it through the driving rain. In his years on this land, he'd seen plenty of animals in distress: wolves, bears, even the occasional wounded deer that had stumbled into his yard seeking help. But this horse was different. The intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it had led him toward the barn, the almost human quality of its distress, it all spoke of something beyond a simple injury. As Jack stood now before the barn doors, rain running off the brim of his hat and thunder rumbling overhead, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd experienced years ago when walking into situations where danger lurked just beyond sight. The horse stood beside him, its breathing labored, but its gaze fixed on the barn doors, as if whatever lay beyond them was worth the pain of the journey. Jack's hand rested on the worn wooden handle of the barn door, and for a moment he hesitated. 15 years of peaceful solitude hung in the balance. He'd worked hard to build a life free from the complications and dangers that had once defined his existence. Opening these doors might mean opening himself up to troubles he'd spent years avoiding. But the horse nickered softly beside him, a sound filled with such desperate hope that it reached something deep in Jack's chest, the part of him that had once sworn to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Margaret had always said that a man's character was revealed not in his triumphs, but in his response to another's need. She'd believed that turning away from suffering, even when it would be easier, was the only true sin a person could commit. The wind picked up, driving the rain harder against the barn's weathered siding. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the yard in stark black and white, and in that brief moment of clarity, Jack saw his reflection in the horse's dark eyes. He saw the man he used to be, the one who'd never walked away from someone in need, no matter the personal cost. With a deep breath that tasted of rain and responsibility, Jack pulled open the barn doors and stepped into the darkness beyond, the injured horse limping faithfully beside him. Whatever awaited them in that shadowy interior would test everything he thought he knew about the quiet life he'd built and the man he'd tried to become. The barn's interior was darker than the storm outside, filled with the familiar scents of hay, leather, and horses. Jack's eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom as he led the injured horse inside, its hooves echoing hollowly on the wooden planks. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the siding, casting dancing shadows across the stalls and equipment. But it was what he saw in the far corner that stopped him cold. A man lay crumpled against the back wall, his clothes torn and blooded, one arm hanging at an unnatural angle. He was young, maybe 25, with dark hair matted with blood and a face that spoke of both determination and desperation. A pair of worn saddlebags lay beside him, their leather darkened with rain, and something that looked suspiciously like more blood. Jack approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip. The stranger's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths alive, but barely. As Jack knelt beside him, the injured horse moved closer, nuzzling the unconscious man's shoulder with a gentleness that spoke of deep familiarity. "Easy there, son," Jack murmured, though whether he was speaking to the horse or the man wasn't entirely clear. He checked the stranger for obvious wounds, finding a deep gash across his ribs and what looked like a bullet graze on his left shoulder. The arm was definitely broken, probably from a fall. The storm raged outside, rain drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. Jack knew he couldn't leave the man here to die, but bringing a stranger into his home carried risks he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Still, some decisions made themselves, and this was one of them. As he prepared to lift the unconscious man, the stranger's eyes fluttered open. They were grey, like storm clouds, and filled with a pain that went deeper than physical injury. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear over the thunder. Jack leaned closer. "What's that, son?" "They're coming," the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible. "The Consolidated Mining Company. They know I have the evidence." His eyes focused on Jack with startling intensity. "You have to warn the others, the water. They're poisoning the water." Before Jack could ask what he meant, the stranger's eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. But clutched in his good hand was a crumpled piece of paper, its edges stained with blood. Jack carefully pried it loose and smoothed it out in the dim light. It was a letter, written in a hasty scrawl. "Thomas, the assay reports confirm our worst fears. The mercury from their operation has already contaminated Willow Creek. If they proceed with the new extraction method, every ranch and farm within 50 miles will be affected. I have the evidence, but Morrison's men found me. Get this to the territorial governor before it's too late. The people have a right to know what's being done to their land. Samuel." Jack read the letter twice, his mind racing. Consolidated Mining Company had been buying up land throughout the territory for months, offering prices that seemed generous until you realized they were essentially forcing people to sell. He'd heard rumors of their operations, but had paid little attention, focused as he was on his own quiet existence. Now he understood why the horse had led him here. This wasn't just about helping an injured man, this was about something that could affect every living soul in the valley. The stranger stirred again, his eyes opening to fix on Jack's face. "The horse," he said, his voice stronger now despite his pain. "She saved my life, threw me clear when they shot her, then carried me here even wounded, smart as any human I've ever known." Jack looked at the mare, seeing her in a new light. The blood on her coat wasn't just from rain and mud she'd been shot too, a graze along her flank that she'd endured to bring her rider to safety. The determination in her eyes made sense now. She'd known exactly where to come for help. "What's your name, son?" Jack asked. "Samuel Hartwell. I work for—" He stopped, studying Jack's face carefully. "I work for people who care about justice." Jack nodded, understanding the careful phrasing. In his years as a marshal, he'd learned to recognize federal agents and their cautious ways. This Samuel was more than he appeared to be, and the letter suggested he was on the trail of something significant. "Can you ride?" Jack asked. Samuel tried to sit up and grimaced. "Not far, not fast." "Then you'll stay here until you can. But first, we need to get you patched up and figure out exactly what kind of trouble you've brought to my doorstep." As if summoned by the conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the storm, multiple riders, moving fast despite the weather. Jack immediately extinguished the lantern he'd lit, plunging the barn back into darkness. "They found us," Samuel whispered, real fear creeping into his voice for the first time. Jack moved to the barn's front window, peering through a gap in the boards. 6 riders approached through the rain, their faces hidden beneath hat brims, but their intentions clear in the way they spread out to surround the barn. These weren't travelers seeking shelter, they moved with the coordination of men who'd done this kind of work before. The lead rider called out over the storm, "We know you're in there, Hartwell. Come out peaceful, and maybe we can work something out." Jack felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same calm that had served him well in dangerous situations throughout his career as a lawman. 15 years of peace were about to end, and despite himself, he felt a stirring of something he'd thought was dead, the need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "How many bullets you got left, Samuel?" Jack asked quietly. The young man checked his gun with his good hand. 3. Jack drew his own weapon, checking the cylinder. 6 shots, clean and ready. Then we'd better make them count. Outside, the riders were growing impatient. Jack could hear them moving around the barn, looking for other ways in. They'd find the back door soon enough, and then the conversation would turn to gunfire. The injured horse stood between Jack and Samuel, as if she understood the danger and was positioning herself to protect them both. In her eyes, Jack saw something that reminded him of Margareta, fierce loyalty that transcended self-preservation. "Samuel," Jack said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I need you to tell me exactly what you found, because I have a feeling that whatever's in those saddlebags of yours is worth more than just our lives." Samuel reached into his saddlebags with his good arm, wincing as the movement aggravated his broken shoulder. What he pulled out made Jack's breath catch in his throw-out silver pocket watch, its surface engraved with an inscription that Jack recognized instantly. "To Marshal William Hartwell, for distinguished service to the territory of Wyoming, 1,869. William Hartwell was my father," Samuel said, his voice heavy with both pride and sorrow. "He spoke of you often, Marshal Monroe, said you were the finest lawman he'd ever served alongside." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. William Hartwell had been more than a colleague, he'd been a mentor, a friend, and one of the few men Jack had truly respected. They'd worked together for 3 years before Jack had met Margaret and settled down, and in all that time, William had never mentioned having a son. "Your father saved my life more times than I can count," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Lost touch with him after I turned in my badge. Heard he'd died a few years back." "Murdered," Samuel corrected, his grey eyes hardening. "Shot in the back by men working for Consolidated Mining. They made it look like a robbery, but I knew better. He'd been investigating their operations for months before he died." Outside, the riders were growing more aggressive. Jack could hear them trying the barn doors, rattling the latches, and discussing their options in voices barely audible over the storm. Time was running short. "Why are you here, Samuel? What did you find that's worth dying for?" Samuel struggled to sit up straighter, his face pale but determined. "The mercury contamination is just the beginning. Consolidated isn't just a mining company. They're a front for a group of investors back east who want to control all the water rights in the territory. They're systematically poisoning water sources to force ranchers and farmers to sell their land for nothing. Then they'll clean up the water and resell the property at enormous profits." The implications hit Jack like a thunderbolt. If Samuel was right, every family in the valley was at risk of losing everything they'd worked for. The Thompsons, the Hendersons, old Mrs. Patterson, who'd been running her small farm since her husband died in the whirl of them, could lose their livelihoods to this scheme. "You have proof?" Jack asked. Samuel nodded toward the saddlebags. "Assay reports, correspondence between company officials, financial records showing the true ownership structure. Enough to bring down the whole operation if it reaches the territorial governor." A loud crash from the back of the barn interrupted their conversation. The riders had found the rear entrance and were forcing their way in. Jack heard the distinctive click of gun hammers being pulled back. "Samuel Hartwell," called the lead rider, his voice carrying clearly through the barn. "We just want to talk. No need for anyone to get hurt." Jack recognized the tone reasonable on the surface, but with an undertone of menace that spoke of violence barely held in check. These weren't men who'd come to negotiate. "My father taught me that when cornered, a man shows his true character," Samuel whispered. "He said you were the kind of man who'd rather die standing than live kneeling." The words awakened something in Jack's chest that he'd thought was long dead. For 15 years, he'd convinced himself that his fighting days were over, that he'd paid his dues to justice and earned the right to live quietly. But looking at this young man, William's son bleeding and desperate in his barn, Jack felt the old fire stirring. "Your father was a good man," Jack said, checking his gun again, "and good men don't let their friends' children die on their watch." The riders were inside the barn now, moving cautiously through the stalls. Jack could see their shadows in the lightning flashes, and he counted 6 distinct figures spreading out to cover all the exits. They were professionals, which meant this wouldn't be easy. Can you move if you have to? Jack asked Samuel. I can try. Good, because we're about to find out if 15 years of peaceful living has made me soft or just patient. Jack positioned himself behind a support beam, the injured horse instinctively moving to shield Samuel from the approaching men. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley like the drums of war, and Jack Monroe began to remember exactly why he'd once been the most feared lawman in the Wyoming Territory. The first shadow appeared at the edge of the lamplight, gun drawn and eyes scanning the darkness. Jack waited, counting heartbeats, feeling the familiar calm that came before action. Some skills, he realized, never truly disappeared. They just waited quietly until they were needed again. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the barn, a different kind of tempest was about to break loose. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours to Jack. When the last gunman fell and the echo of gunshots faded into the storm's roar, 4 men lay dead in his barn, and 2 had fled into the night. Jack stood amid the carnage, smoke curling from his Colt's barrel, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle into his bones. Samuel was unconscious again, having passed out from pain during the battle. The injured horse stood protectively over him, her flanks heaving but her spirit unbroken. Jack holstered his weapon and knelt beside the young man, checking his pulse. Strong and steady he'd live, given proper care. It was then that Jack noticed something had fallen from Samuel's saddlebags during the fight. A torn piece of map, its edges blackened with what looked like soot. Jack picked it up carefully, studying the markings by lamplight. It showed a network of mine shafts and water sources throughout the territory, with notations in different handwritings, marking contamination levels and projected expansion sites. The implications were staggering. Consolidated Mining wasn't just operating 1 or 2 sites, they had plans for the entire valley system. Every creek, every spring, every source of water that ranchers and farmers depended on was marked for potential contamination or control. Jack was still studying the map when he heard riders approaching again. But these hoofbeats were different, fewer horses, moving at a measured pace rather than the urgent gallop of the gunman. He peered out through the barn window and recognized the familiar silhouette of Doc Williams, his medical bag slung across his saddle. "Jack," the doctor called through the storm. "Heard shooting. You all right in there?" "Come on in, Doc," Jack replied, holstering his gun. "Got a patient for you." Doc Williams entered the barn and stopped short at the sight of the bodies. His weathered face remained impassive as he took in the scene, but Jack caught the slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of concern. "Looks like your quiet life just got complicated," Doc observed, kneeling beside Samuel to examine his injuries. "Appears so," Jack agreed. "Doc, what do you know about Consolidated Mining Company?" The older man's hands stilled for a moment as he worked on Samuel's shoulder. "More than I'd like to, less than I should. They've been making offers on property throughout the territory. Some folks have sold, others are holding out. There's been talk of unusual illnesses among the livestock downstream from their operations." "Unusual how?" "Hair falling out, cattle refusing to drink from certain streams, birth defects in calves. I've been documenting cases, but without proof of causation, it's just speculation." Doc's voice carried the frustration of a man who'd seen suffering he couldn't fully explain or treat. Jack handed him the torn map. "This might be your proof." Doc studied the markings, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he whispered. "If this is accurate, they're planning to contaminate every major water source in 3 counties. The young man's name is Samuel Hartwell. He's William's son." Doc's hands paused again. "William Hartwell, the marshal who was killed in Cheyenne." "The same. Samuel's been investigating his father's murder and uncovered this conspiracy. Those men who came here tonight were trying to stop him from getting the evidence to the territorial governor." Doc worked in silence for several minutes, setting Samuel's arm and cleaning his wounds with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen too much violence in his lifetime. Finally, he spoke without looking up from his patient. "Jack, you know what this means. If Consolidated is willing to kill federal agents and send gunmen after witnesses, they're not going to stop just because we fought off one group. They'll send more men, better armed, and more desperate. Jack nodded grimly. He'd already come to the same conclusion. How long before he can travel? Few days, minimum. That shoulder needs time to set properly, and he's lost a good deal of blood. Moving him too soon could kill him as surely as those gunmen would have. The injured horse had settled down beside Samuel, as if she understood that her rider was in good hands now. Jack studied the animal with new respect. She'd taken a bullet to save her rider, then led him through a storm to the one place in the territory where he might find both healing and protection. "Doc, I need you to do something for me," Jack said. "I need you to ride into town tomorrow and have a quiet word with Sheriff Hayes. Tell him what we've found here, but keep it between the three of us for now. If this conspiracy reaches as high as Samuel suggests, we can't be sure who else might be involved." "And what will you be doing?" Jack looked down at Samuel's pale face, then at the map with its network of planned contamination sites. "I'll be remembering what it feels like to be a lawman again." Doc finished his work and packed his supplies. "Jack, you've been out of this life for 15 years. Are you sure you want to step back into it?" It was a fair question, and Jack considered it carefully before answering. The peaceful life he'd built was precious to him, bought with years of grief and hard-won acceptance. But looking at Samuel Williams' son, fighting his father's fight, Jack realized that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort. "I'm sure that William Hartwell's son isn't going to die in my barn while men who profit from poisoning the land walk free," Jack said firmly. "Beyond that, I'll figure it out as I go." Doc nodded, understanding flickering in his tired eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on him. And Jack, be careful. The men who killed William won't hesitate to kill you too." After Doc left, Jack spent the night keeping watch over Samuel and the horse, both of whom slept fitfully despite their injuries. He studied the map and the blood-stained letter, memorizing every detail and trying to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to subside, Jack made his decision. The quiet, isolated life he'd built was over. William Hartwell had been more than a friend he'd been, a brother in arms, a man who'd stood beside him when bullets flew and justice hung in the balance. His son deserved the same loyalty, and the people of the valley deserved protection from those who would poison their land for profit. Jack Monroe, former territorial marshal, was about to come out of retirement. 3 days after the gunfight, Samuel was strong enough to sit up and tell his full story. Doc Williams had returned twice to check on his progress, and each visit had brought more disturbing news from town. 2 more ranchers had sold their property to Consolidated Mining, and there were reports of strange illnesses affecting livestock throughout the valley. Jack sat across from Samuel in the barn, which had become their temporary headquarters. The injured horse, whom Samuel called Sage, had recovered enough to move around freely, though she still favored her wounded leg. The map and documents were spread between them on a makeshift table fashioned from hay bales and planks. "The mining company deed is the key to everything," Samuel explained, pointing to a document that had been hidden in a secret compartment of his saddlebags. "It shows the real ownership structure shell companies within shell companies, all leading back to a consortium of Eastern investors. But look at these signatures." Jack examined the deed carefully. Several of the signatures looked suspicious, with slight variations in penmanship that suggested forgery. More troubling were the names some belonged to territorial officials who would have had the authority to grant extensive mining rights. "You think they've bought off government officials?" Jack asked. "I know they have. My father was investigating corruption that went all the way to the territorial capital. That's why they killed him, not just for what he'd discovered about the mining operation, but for what he'd learned about the officials taking bribes to look the other way." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Jack moved immediately to the window, but relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Hayes riding alone toward the ranch. The lawman looked tired and troubled as he dismounted, his usual easy confidence replaced by something closer to resignation. "Jack," Hayes called out, "we need to talk." Jack stepped outside to meet him, leaving Samuel hidden in the barn. The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture Jack remembered from their previous encounters when Hayes was dealing with particularly difficult problems. "Doc Williams told me about your visitor," Hayes said without preamble, "and about what he's carrying. What's your read on the situation, Sheriff?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon where storm clouds still lingered. "I've been getting pressure from territorial officials to stop investigating the livestock deaths. Been told it's outside my jurisdiction and that Consolidated Mining has all proper permits for their operations." "But you don't believe that?" "I've been sheriff in this territory for 12 years, Jack. I know the difference between natural illness and poisoning. I also know the difference between legitimate business and criminal conspiracy." Hayes's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen his authority undermined by forces beyond his control. Jack studied the sheriff's face, reading the conflict there. Hayes was an honest man, trapped in a situation where honesty might not be enough. "What are you asking me, Sheriff?" "I'm asking if you're planning to get involved in this, because if you are, I need to know where you stand. The Territorial Marshal's office has been asking questions about federal agents operating in my jurisdiction. They want to know if I've seen Samuel Hartwell." The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jack understood the position Hayes was in court between his duty to uphold the law and his suspicion that the law itself might be compromised. It was the kind of impossible situation that had driven Jack away from law enforcement in the first place. "Sheriff, 15 years ago, I swore an oath to protect the innocent and uphold justice. I may not wear a badge anymore, but that oath doesn't have an expiration date." Hayes nodded slowly, as if Jack's answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then you should know that Consolidated has hired additional security. Professional gunmen from Kansas City, by the look of them. They're not planning to rely on local intimidation anymore." "How many?" "At least a dozen that I've seen, maybe more arriving daily. They're setting up a base of operations at the old Morrison place, bought it last month for twice what it was worth." Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the anticipation of serious trouble. A dozen professional gunmen changed the equation considerably. This wasn't going to be settled with a single shootout in a barn. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "I've been doing some quiet investigating of my own. The territorial officials who've been pressuring me to back off some of them have been making deposits in the Cheyenne Bank that are well beyond their government salaries. The corruption was deeper than even Samuel had suspected. If territorial officials were taking bribes, then the normal channels of justice were compromised. Getting evidence to the governor might not be enough. They'd need to find another way to expose the conspiracy. "Sheriff, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. If this thing goes sideways, if it comes down to choosing between following orders from corrupted officials and doing what's right for the people of this territory, which way will you fall?" Hayes looked Jack directly in the eye, and for a moment the years fell away, and Jack saw the young deputy who'd first pinned on a badge with idealism burning bright in his heart. "The day I stop protecting the innocent is the day I don't deserve to wear this star," Hayes said simply. It was the answer Jack had hoped for, but it also meant that Hayes would be putting his career and possibly his life on the line. The sheriff seemed to understand the implications as well as Jack did. "I'll give you 3 days head start before I have to report that I haven't seen Samuel Hartwell," Hayes said. "After that, I'll have federal marshals crawling all over my territory, and I won't be able to protect either of you." Jack shook the sheriff's hand, feeling the firm grip of a man he could trust. 3 days should be enough. After Hayes left, Jack returned to the barn where Samuel was studying the documents with renewed intensity. Sage stood nearby, as if she understood that her rider was planning something dangerous. "I heard most of that conversation," Samuel said. "We're running out of time." "Then we'd better make good use of what we have left," Jack replied. "Tell me everything you know about Consolidated's operation, where they're based, who's running things locally, what kind of security they have." As Samuel began to outline what he'd learned during months of investigation, Jack felt his mind shifting into the tactical thinking that had once made him so effective as a lawman. The peaceful rancher was giving way to the marshal he'd once been, and despite the danger ahead, it felt like coming home. The next morning brought clear skies and a decision that Jack knew would change everything. As he saddled his horse for the ride into Cedar Falls, he fingered the chain around his neck that held Margaret's wedding ring. He'd worn it every day since her death, a reminder of the love that had once filled his life and the principles she'd died believing in. Margaret had always said that standing up for others wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only way to honor the gifts life had given you. Samuel was well enough to travel short distances now, though Doc Williams had insisted he stay close to the ranch for another few days. The young man had wanted to accompany Jack into town, but Jack had refused. Someone needed to guard the evidence, and Samuel was still too recognizable to the remaining gunman who'd escaped the barn fight. Cedar Falls looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, its main street lined with the familiar businesses that had served the community for decades. But Jack noticed changes that spoke of Consolidated Mining's growing influence. The general store had a new coat of paint and expanded inventory. The saloon had been renovated with expensive fixtures that seemed out of place in the frontier town. Most telling of all, there were strangers in town, well-dressed men who didn't look like ranchers or merchants, their eyes constantly scanning the street with the alertness of hired security. Jack's first stop was the bank, where he hoped to gather information about the financial pressures being applied to local landowners. The banker, Henry Carlyle, had known Jack for years and greeted him with the careful courtesy of a man who'd heard rumors about recent events. "Jack Monroe," Carlyle said, rising from behind his desk. "Haven't seen you in town for quite some time. Been keeping to myself, Henry, but I'm hearing disturbing stories about folks being pressured to sell their land. Thought you might have some insight into what's happening." Carlyle's expression grew guarded. "Well, it's true that Consolidated Mining has been making generous offers for property throughout the valley. Some folks have found the terms too good to refuse." Generous offers, or threats disguised as offers? The banker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Jack, I'm not sure what you're implying, but Consolidated is a legitimate business enterprise with proper backing and documentation. They've been nothing but professional in their dealings with this bank." Jack studied Carlyle's face, reading the fear beneath the careful words. "Henry, how long have we known each other? 20 years? In all that time, have I ever known you to be frightened of legitimate businessmen?" Carlyle looked around his office as if checking for listening ears, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Jack, there are things happening in this territory that go beyond my understanding or authority. Powerful people are involved, people who don't appreciate questions about their methods. My advice to you is to keep your head down and tend to your ranch." It was the response of a frightened man, but not a dishonest one. Jack understood that Carlyle was caught in the same web of pressure and intimidation that was affecting everyone in the valley. The banker probably knew more than he was saying, but fear was keeping him silent. Jack's next stop was the general store, where he hoped to gather information from the townspeople who congregated there for news and gossip. What he found instead was a community living under a shadow of fear. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who ran a small farm north of town, was standing at the counter looking pale and shaken. Her hands trembled as she counted out coins to pay for her supplies, more coins than Jack would have expected from someone whose farm had been struggling. "Mrs. Patterson," Jack said gently, approaching her with the careful manner he'd once used with frightened witnesses. "How are you holding up?" The old woman looked up at him with eyes red from crying. "Oh, Jack, I'm glad to see you. I've been hoping someone would come forward to help us understand what's happening." "What do you mean?" "The mining company made me an offer for my farm yesterday, a very generous offer, they said. But when I told them I wasn't interested in selling, they suggested I might want to reconsider. Said there were health risks associated with staying on contaminated land." Jack felt anger building in his chest. "Did they specify what kind of health risks?" "They showed me a report claiming that my well water was contaminated with mercury. Said it could cause serious illness if I continued drinking it. But Jack, that well has been providing clean water for 40 years. My husband dug it himself, and we never had a day's illness from drinking that water. The pattern was becoming clear. Consolidated was using fabricated health scares to pressure landowners into selling. They'd create the contamination, then offer to rescue people from the very problems they'd caused. Mrs. Patterson, do you still have a copy of that report? She nodded and pulled a folded paper from her reticule. Jack examined it carefully, noting the official-looking letterhead and scientific language that would intimidate most people into accepting its conclusions. But his years as a lawman had taught him to spot fraudulent documents, and this one had several telltale signs of forgery. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to do me a favor. Don't make any decisions about selling your farm until you've had that well water tested by an independent source. Doc Williams can arrange for proper testing that you can trust. Hope flickered in the old woman's eyes. You really think the report might be false? I think there are people who profit from your fear, and they're not above lying to get what they want. Jack spent the rest of the morning talking to other townspeople, hearing similar stories of pressure, intimidation, and fabricated health scares. The pattern was consistent. Consolidated would approach landowners with generous offers, and when those were refused, they'd produce alarming reports about contamination or health risks that coincidentally made staying on the land seem dangerous. But it was his conversation with Tom Henderson that revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. Henderson, a sturdy rancher who'd been in the valley since before Jack arrived, pulled him aside as he was leaving the general store. Jack, I need to tell you something, but not here where folks can overhear. Can you ride out to my place this afternoon? Jack agreed, and when he arrived at the Henderson ranch later that day, he found a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. Henderson's wife and children were nowhere to be seen, and the house had the hollow feeling of a place where people were afraid to speak freely. They took my youngest boy, Jack, Henderson said without preamble. Said it was for his own protection, given the health risks on the ranch. But they made it clear that his safety depended on my cooperation with their business proposals. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Kidnapping children to force their parents to sell land was beyond business intimidation. It was terrorism, pure and simple. Where is he now? They say he's in a special facility in Cheyenne, getting medical care for exposure to contaminated water. But I'm not allowed to see him until certain legal matters are resolved. Jack understood now why the community was living in fear. Consolidated wasn't just threatening livelihoods, they were threatening families. And if they were willing to kidnap children, there was no limit to what they might do to protect their conspiracy. As he rode back toward his ranch, Jack fingered Margaret's ring again and thought about the conversation they'd had the night before she died. She'd been weak with fever, but her mind had been clear as she'd made him promise to always fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The measure of a man isn't what he accomplishes when he's strong, she'd whispered. It's what he does when others are weak and need his strength. Jack Monroe had spent 15 years trying to forget that promise. But now, with a kidnapped child's life hanging in the balance and an entire community living in fear, he realized that some promises could never be forgottenly honored or betrayed. The time for quiet retirement was over. The war for the soul of the Wyoming Territory was about to begin. Jack returned to his ranch as the sun was setting, his mind heavy with the weight of what he'd learned in town. The kidnapping of Tom Henderson's boy had changed everything. This was no longer just about corruption or even poisoning water supplies. This was about children being used as weapons against their own parents. Samuel was waiting for him in the barn, looking stronger but troubled. Sage stood nearby, her intelligent eyes reflecting the same concern that Jack felt building in his chest. "How bad is it?" Samuel asked without preamble. Jack told him everything, the intimidation tactics, the fabricated health reports, and finally, the kidnapping. Samuel's face grew increasingly grim as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "We have to get that evidence to someone in authority who isn't compromised," Samuel said. "But who?" If territorial officials are taking bribes and federal marshals aren't responding to reports of missing agents, then who can we trust? Before Jack could answer, they heard the sound of a single horse approaching at a measured pace. Jack moved to the window, expecting to see Doc Williams, or perhaps Sheriff Hayes. Instead, he saw a figure that made his blood run colder, tall man, in a dark coat, riding with the confident posture of someone who'd never known fear. The rider dismounted and called out, "Monroe, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Jack recognized the voice immediately, though he hadn't heard it in 15 years. It belonged to Marcus Blackwood, the most dangerous man Jack had ever encountered during his time as a marshal. Blackwood had been a federal agent then, but his methods had been so ruthless that even other lawmen had questioned his techniques. "Stay hidden," Jack whispered to Samuel, then stepped out of the barn to face his unexpected visitor. Blackwood looked exactly as Jack remembered him: lean, predatory, with eyes that seemed to catalogue every weakness in the people he encountered. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and lines of cruelty had deepened around his mouth. But the essential menace of the man remained unchanged. "Hello, Jack," Blackwood said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You're looking well for a man who's supposed to be dead." "Marcus, can't say I'm surprised to find you mixed up in this mess, though I figured even you wouldn't stoop to kidnapping children." Blackwood's smile widened. "Ah, you've heard about young Henderson. Regrettable but necessary. Sometimes pressure must be applied in creative ways to achieve larger goals." "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want Samuel Hartwell and the documents he's carrying. Hand them over, and I'll make sure Tom Henderson's boy finds his way home safely." "Refuse, and well," Blackwood shrugged eloquently. "Accidents happen to children all the time." Jack felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had once made him so effective against the worst criminals in the territory. But he kept his voice level. "You're working for Consolidated Mining?" "I'm working for progress, Jack. The kind of progress that transforms wilderness into civilization, that turns worthless rock into profitable enterprise. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." "Like murdering federal agents?" Blackwood's expression didn't change. William Hartwell was investigating things beyond his understanding. He wouldn't listen to reason, so reason had to be applied more forcefully. The casual admission of murder confirmed what Jack had suspected. Blackwood wasn't just working with Consolidated Mining, he was running their security operations. And that meant the corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. "There's something you should know, Jack," Blackwood continued, "about why I'm really here." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder, opening it to reveal an official document with a federal seal. Jack's heart sank as he recognized what it was: a U.S. Marshal's commission issued to Marcus Blackwood. "That's right, old friend. I'm not just working with federal authority, I am federal authority in this territory. Every investigation, every arrest, every decision about law enforcement goes through me." The implications hit Jack like a sledgehammer. If Blackwood was the territorial marshal, then the entire law enforcement structure was compromised. There was no higher authority to appeal to, no honest federal agent to contact. Blackwood controlled the very system that was supposed to protect people from men like him. "Samuel Hartwell is wanted for the murder of 4 security officers," Blackwood said, his voice taking on an official tone. "He's also suspected of stealing confidential mining company documents and threatening territorial officials. As a federal marshal, I have the authority to demand his immediate surrender." Jack's mind raced as he processed this information. Blackwood had managed to position himself as both the architect of the conspiracy and the law enforcement official responsible for investigating it. It was a perfect setup. Any evidence that threatened the operation could be suppressed under the guise of an ongoing federal investigation. "You always were ambitious, Marcus, but this is beyond even your usual standards of corruption." "Corruption?" Blackwood looked genuinely offended. "Jack, you disappoint me. This isn't corruption, it's evolution. The old ways of doing things, the small-scale ranching and farming that barely scratches the surface of this land's potential, are obsolete. Consolidated Mining represents the future large-scale resource extraction that will bring real wealth to this territory. By poisoning the water and forcing families from their homes, By maximizing the efficient use of natural resources, a few displaced ranchers is a small price to pay for the prosperity that mining will bring to thousands of people. Jack realized that Blackwood actually believed what he was saying. In his mind, the conspiracy wasn't criminal, it was progress. That made him more dangerous than a simple criminal, because he had the conviction of a man who believed his cause was righteous. "I'll give you 1 hour to produce Samuel Hartwell and his stolen documents," Blackwood said, pulling out an expensive pocket watch. "After that, I'll return with federal warrants and sufficient manpower to search every building on this property. And Jack, if I have to come back, Tom Henderson's boy won't be the only child who suffers for your obstinacy." Blackwood remounted his horse and rode away, leaving Jack standing in the gathering darkness with the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. Behind him, he heard movement in the barn as Samuel emerged from hiding. "I heard everything," Samuel said quietly. "Jack, you have to turn me in. That boy's life is more important than the evidence I'm carrying." Jack looked at the young man, William's son, carrying on his father's fight against impossible odds and felt something crystallize in his mind. For 15 years, he'd tried to convince himself that one man couldn't make a difference against systematic corruption. But now, faced with the choice between surrender and resistance, he remembered why he'd become a lawman in the first place. "Samuel, there's something I need to show you," Jack said, leading him back into the barn. He went to his old travel chest, the one he hadn't opened since arriving at the ranch 15 years ago. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was his official U.S. Marshal's badge, the star he'd worn during the years when justice had been more than just a word. "Marcus Blackwood may wear a federal badge now," Jack said, pinning the star to his vest. "But some of us earned the right to wear one, and federal marshals don't surrender to corruption, they fight it." Samuel stared at the badge, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're still a marshal?" "I never officially resigned, just took an extended leave of absence." Jack checked his guns, making sure they were loaded and ready. "Which means I have the same federal authority that Blackwood claims and a better claim to legitimacy." For the first time since the gunfight, Samuel smiled. "My father always said you were the most stubborn man he'd ever met." "Your father was a good judge of character," Jack replied. "Now let's figure out how to save that boy and bring down this conspiracy before Blackwood realizes he's not the only federal marshal in the territory." The hour that Blackwood had given them passed like minutes as Jack and Samuel worked feverishly to prepare for what was coming. Jack's federal marshal badge gleamed in the lamplight, a symbol of legitimate authority that could challenge Blackwood's manufactured jurisdiction if they lived long enough to use it. Samuel had recovered enough to be mobile, though his arm was still in a sling, and he moved with the careful gait of a man nursing serious injuries. Sage stood nearby, alert and ready, despite her own wounds. The horse seemed to understand that another fight was coming, and her loyalty to Samuel extended to sharing his dangers. "We need to get word to Sheriff Hayes," Jack said, checking his weapons for the 3rd time. "He needs to know about Blackwood's real position and the federal authority we're claiming." "How?" "Blackwood will have men watching the roads between here and town." Jack smiled grimly. "Then we don't use the roads." He led Samuel to the back of the barn, where a narrow trail wound through the hills toward Cedar Falls. It was a path he'd used for hunting, barely wide enough for a horse, but invisible to anyone who didn't know the territory intimately. "Can you ride?" Jack asked. Samuel nodded, though the effort of saddling Sage clearly caused him pain. "What's the plan?" "We split up. You take the evidence and head for Sheriff Hayes. I'll stay here and face Blackwood when he returns. With any luck, I can buy you enough time to get those documents into honest hands." "That's suicide, Jack. Blackwood won't come alone, and you can't fight a dozen men by yourself. I've fought worse odds." Samuel studied Jack's face, seeing the determination there. "This isn't just about the evidence, is it? This is about that kidnapped boy." Jack nodded slowly. "Tom Henderson's son is 8 years old, Samuel, same age I was when my father died. If we run now, if we abandon him to save ourselves, then we're no better than the men we're fighting." From the barn, Jack retrieved his late wife's Bible, the one possession of Margaret's that he'd carried with him from Iowa. Its pages were filled with pressed flowers she'd collected during their brief time together, and her handwriting filled the margins with thoughts and prayers that had sustained him through the darkest times of his grief. She believed that every person mattered, Jack said, running his fingers over Margaret's faded script. That protecting the innocent was the highest calling a man could have. I lost sight of that for 15 years, but I won't lose it again. Samuel understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about fighting corruption, it was about Jack reclaiming the part of himself that had died with his wife. The marshal's badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a symbol of the man he'd once been and could be again. There's something else we need to consider, Samuel said quietly. If Blackwood is the territorial marshal, then my father wasn't killed by mining company security. He was killed by a federal agent. The implications were staggering. William Hartwell hadn't just been murdered by criminal, she'd been executed by the very system he'd sworn to serve. It added another layer of betrayal to an already monstrous conspiracy. Doc Williams arrived, just as Samuel was preparing to leave, his medical bag in one hand and an old army rifle in the other. The physician's weathered face was set with the kind of determination Jack remembered from battlefield surgeons during the war. "Heard there might be trouble coming," Doc said without preamble. "Figured you could use an extra gun." "Doc, this isn't your fight," Jack protested. "The hell it isn't. I've been watching this community die from fear and intimidation. I've seen children torn from their families and honest folks driven from land their ancestors died to protect. If that's not worth fighting for, then nothing is." Doc's presence changed the tactical situation significantly. 3 men, even with Samuel wounded, could hold the ranch against a larger force if they chose their positions carefully. More importantly, Doc's medical skills might mean the difference between life and death if anyone was seriously wounded. "All right," Jack said, making a quick decision. "New plan. Doc, you and Samuel take the evidence to Sheriff Hayes. I'll hold the ranch and try to learn where they're keeping the Henderson boy." "And if Blackwood decides to kill you rather than negotiate?" Samuel asked. Jack checked his guns one final time. "Then you make sure the truth about this conspiracy reaches someone who can act on it. Promise me, Samuel, no matter what happens here, you see this through to the end." Samuel clasped Jack's hand with his good arm. "I promise. But Jack, me father always said you were too stubborn to die easy. Don't prove him wrong." Doc and Samuel mounted their horses and disappeared into the darkness, following the hidden trail toward town. Jack watched them go, then turned his attention to preparing the ranch for siege. He positioned extra ammunition in strategic locations, checked the water supply, and made sure the horses were secure. If Blackwood wanted a fight, Jack would give him one he wouldn't forget. As he worked, Jack found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. 15 years ago, he'd turned in his badge because he'd lost faith in justice. The death of his wife had convinced him that good people suffered while evil ones prospered, and that all his efforts to protect the innocent had been futile. But looking at the evidence Samuel had gathered, the proof of systematic corruption and exploitation, Jack realized that his years of isolation hadn't been wasted. They'd been preparation. He'd needed those years to heal from his losses and regain the strength to fight again. Now, faced with a conspiracy that threatened everything he'd come to love about this valley, he felt the fire of purpose burning in his chest once more. The sound of approaching horses reached him just as he finished his preparations. Multiple riders, moving fast despite the darkness. Blackwood was returning, and he wasn't alone. Jack positioned himself behind the water trough in front of the barn, his rifle ready and his sidearm loaded. The federal marshal's badge on his chest caught the moonlight, and for a moment he felt the weight of all the oaths he'd taken during his years of service. Margaret's Bible lay open beside him, her pressed flowers visible in the pale light. On the page before him, her handwriting formed a prayer she'd written during his most dangerous assignment. "Lord, protect those who stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Give them strength for the fight and wisdom to know right from wrong." Jack smiled as he read the words. Even in death, Margaret was still guiding him toward the light. The riders were close now, their horses' hoofbeats echoing off the hills. Jack counted at least 10 men, maybe more, professional gunmen, by the sound of their movement, disciplined and coordinated. A voice called out through the darkness, "Monroe, you've had your hour. Send out Samuel Hartwell, and this can end peacefully." Jack stood up slowly, the federal marshal's badge visible on his chest. "Marcus," he called back, "I'm afraid I have some bad news for you. Samuel Hartwell is under the protection of a federal marshal, the real kind, not the bought and paid for variety." The silence that followed was profound. Jack could almost hear Blackwood processing this unexpected development, trying to understand how his carefully constructed authority had been challenged. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "You always were full of surprises, Jack, but it won't matter. Federal marshal or not, you're outnumbered 10-1. Then I guess we'll find out if federal authority still means something in this territory," Jack replied. The battle for the soul of Wyoming was about to begin. The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Jack dove behind the water trough as bullets splintered the wood above his head, his mind automatically cataloguing the positions of Blackwood's men from the sound and direction of their gunfire. 10 men, spread in a semicircle around the ranch buildings. Professional gunmen, as he'd suspected, but they were making the mistake of treating this like a simple elimination job rather than a tactical engagement against someone who understood warfare. Jack's antique Colt, revolver, the one his father had carried during his own service, as a lawman, felt solid and familiar in his hand. The weapon had been passed down through 3 generations of Monroe men, and it had never failed when justice needed a steady hand behind it. A shadow moved near the barn's corner, and Jack's shot took the gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a pile of fence posts. The man's scream echoed across the yard, and Jack heard Blackwood's voice shouting orders to his remaining men. "He's alone. Spread out and flank him." But Jack wasn't planning to make it easy for them. He'd spent weeks studying every inch of this property, and he knew exactly how to use the terrain to his advantage. Rolling away from the water trough, he made his way toward the tool shed, using the darkness and his knowledge of the ground to stay ahead of the gunman trying to surround him. Another muzzle flash revealed a man creeping around the side of the house. Jack's rifle spoke once, and the gunman dropped his weapon, clutching a shattered arm. 2 down, 8 to go. "Monroe," Blackwood's voice carried a note of frustration now. "You're only delaying the inevitable. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." Jack's response was a carefully aimed shot that sent Blackwood diving for cover behind his horse. The corrupt marshal's hat went flying, and Jack allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at rattling the man's composure. But the gunfight was far from over. Blackwood's men were adapting to Jack's tactics, moving more carefully and using covering fire to advance on his position. Jack found himself being pushed back toward the house, his ammunition running lower with each exchange. It was then that he heard the sound he'd been hoping for, horses approaching from the direction of town. Not the measured pace of Blackwood's professionals, but the urgent gallop of men riding hard with purpose. Sheriff Hayes's voice cut through the gunfire. "This is the law. Lay down your weapons." The sheriff had brought a posse. Jack counted at least 6 riders, probably volunteers from town, who'd been waiting for someone in authority to take a stand against Consolidated Mining's intimidation. Blackwood's position had suddenly become untenable. Caught between Jack's defensive fire and Hayes's posse, his men found themselves surrounded instead of surrounding. But instead of surrendering, Blackwood made a decision that revealed the true depth of his corruption. "Kill them all," he shouted to his remaining gunmen. "No witnesses." The order to murder a sheriff and his legally constituted posse crossed a line that even hardened criminals rarely approached. It meant that Blackwood was willing to start a war rather than face justice for his crimes. The battle intensified as Hayes and his men engaged Blackwood's gunmen. Jack used the confusion to advance on the corrupt marshal's position. His father's cult, ready for the confrontation he'd known, was inevitable since the moment Blackwood had revealed his true nature. He found the man crouched behind an overturned wagon, frantically reloading his weapon. In the moonlight, Blackwood's face showed none of the confident menace it had carried earlier. Instead, Jack saw the desperation of a man who'd gambled everything on a conspiracy that was collapsing around him. "It's over, Marcus," Jack said, his gun trained on the corrupt marshal. "Your men are surrounded, and Sheriff Hayes has federal authority to arrest you for conspiracy and murder." Blackwood looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You always were a self-righteous fool, Jack. You think taking down one operation will change anything? There are dozens of companies like Consolidated, hundreds of officials who understand that progress requires difficult choices." "Maybe so, but this company ends tonight, and those officials will think twice before they try the same tactics in my territory." Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, and Jack saw the decision forming in the man's eyes. There would be no surrender, no attempt to negotiate or escape. Marcus Blackwood would rather die fighting than face the consequences of his actions. The corrupt marshal's draw was faster than Jack had expected, but 15 years of target practice and a lifetime of experience with violence gave Jack the edge he needed. His father's Colt spoke with the voice of justice, and Marcus Blackwood fell backward into the dirt, his stolen badge glinting in the moonlight. The gunfire died away as the last of Blackwood's men either surrendered or fled into the darkness. Sheriff Hayes and his posse had proven more effective than Jack had dared hope, and the ranch yard was now secure. But even as Jack surveyed the scene of their victory, he knew the real fight was just beginning. Blackwood lay motionless beside the overturned wagon, his corrupt authority ended forever. But his death, while satisfying a deep need for justice, didn't solve the larger problem of the conspiracy he'd helped orchestrate. Somewhere in the darkness, Tom Henderson's 8-year-old son was still being held prisoner, and Consolidated Mining still had the resources to continue their campaign of intimidation and corruption. Doc Williams and Samuel emerged from the shadows where they'd been waiting for the battle to end. Samuel's face was grim but determined as he approached Jack, a leather folder clutched in his good hand. "Sheriff Hayes has agreed to serve the federal warrants," Samuel said, "but we need to move fast. Blackwood's death will send a message to his superiors, and they'll either abandon the operation or escalate it beyond anything we've seen so far." Jack nodded, understanding the implications. With their territorial marshal dead and their local operation exposed, Consolidated's backers would have to make a choice: cut their losses and retreat, or double down with even more violent tactics. "Did you find out where they're holding the Henderson boy?" Jack asked. Hayes approached them, his badge gleaming in the moonlight. "We got that information from one of the gunmen who surrendered. The boy's being held at the old Morrison place, along with 3 other children whose parents have been resistant to selling their land." The revelation that multiple children had been kidnapped hit Jack like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Tom Henderson's son, it was about a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the will of anyone who stood in Consolidated's way. "How many guards?" Jack asked. "At least 6, maybe more. They're expecting Blackwood to return with Samuel Hartwell in custody, which gives us an advantage if we move quickly." Samuel pulled out the original land grants that he'd discovered among his father's papers, the documents that proved the water rights throughout the valley belonged to the original homesteaders, not to any mining company. These papers, if properly authenticated and filed with territorial authorities, would legally invalidate every claim Consolidated had made. "These documents will stop the mining operation," Samuel said, "but first we have to save those children." Jack studied the faces of the men around him: Hayes, Doc Williams, Samuel, and the volunteer posse members who'd risked their lives to confront corruption. They were good men, honest men, but they weren't professional fighters. A rescue mission against hardened gunmen would require the kind of tactical thinking that Jack had learned during his years as a marshal. "Sheriff, I need you to take half your men and secure the territorial telegraph office," Jack said, his mind working through the logistics of what they needed to accomplish. Samuel's evidence needs to reach the governor and the federal authorities in Washington. If this conspiracy reaches as high as we suspect, we'll need support from outside the territory. What about the children? Hayes asked. Doc Samuel, and I will handle the rescue. We know the Morrison place, and we have the element of surprise. Jack's voice carried the authority of a man who'd planned dangerous operations before. But Sheriff, if we're not back by dawn, you send those documents to every federal authority you can reach. Don't let our deaths be meaningless. The old Morrison place sat in a natural bowl of land about 5 miles from Jack's ranch, surrounded by hills that provided excellent cover for an approach. Jack had hunted in the area for years and knew every path and hiding spot. More importantly, he knew the layout of the buildings and the best approaches for a surprise attack. As they prepared to leave, Doc Williams surprised Jack by pulling an old Army medical kit from his saddlebags. Served as a battlefield surgeon during the war, he explained. If those children have been mistreated, they'll need immediate medical attention. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode through the darkness toward the Morrison place, each carrying the weight of what they were about to attempt. Jack felt the familiar pre-combat calm settling over him, the same focused clarity that had served him well in countless dangerous situations. But this mission was different. The stakes weren't just about justice or stopping corruption, they were about innocent children whose only crime had been having parents who refused to be intimidated. Failure wasn't just unthinkable, it was unacceptable. They reached the hills overlooking the Morrison place just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Below them, the old ranch house sat dark and quiet, with only a single light visible in what had once been the kitchen. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter with the lazy confidence of men who didn't expect trouble. The children will be in the main house, Jack whispered. Probably the back bedrooms where they can't be seen from the road. We'll need to take out the guards silently, then move fast before anyone inside realizes what's happening. Samuel checked his gun with his good hand. I can handle myself despite the arm. I know you can. Your father would be proud. They moved down the hill like ghosts, using the pre-dawn darkness to mask their approach. Jack took the first guard with a blow to the head that dropped him silently to the ground. Samuel, despite his wounded arm, managed to disable the second guard before the man could raise an alarm. The real challenge would be getting into the house and reaching the children before the remaining guards could use them as hostages. Jack had seen enough desperate criminals to know that cornered men would do anything to escape, including harming innocent children. But as they approached the house, they heard something that changed everything. A child's voice, thin and frightened, calling out through the darkness, "Papa, is someone coming to help us?" It was Tom Henderson's boy, and he was alive and alert enough to recognize the sounds of a rescue attempt. Jack felt his heart surge with hope and determination as he prepared to breach the house and end this nightmare once and for all. 3 months later, Jack Monroe stood on his porch watching the morning sun rise over the Medicine Bow Mountains, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands and a sense of peace in his heart that he hadn't felt in 15 years. The valley spread out before him, green and healthy, with Willow Creek running clear and strong through land that would remain in the hands of the families who'd worked it for generations. The rescue of the children had been successful. All 4 had been returned to their families, unharmed, though it had taken weeks for the fear to fade from their eyes. Tom Henderson's boy had hugged his father with a fierceness that brought tears to grown men's eyes, and the sight had reminded Jack why some fights were worth any cost. Consolidated Mining Company had collapsed within days of Blackwood's death and the exposure of their conspiracy. The evidence Samuel Hartwell had gathered, combined with the original land grants protecting water rights, had reached federal authorities who moved swiftly to shut down the operation and arrest the Eastern investors behind it. Several territorial officials had been removed from office, and new legislation was being drafted to prevent similar schemes in the future. Samuel had accepted a position as a federal marshal, carrying on his father's work with the same dedication and integrity that had cost William Hartwell his life. He visited Jack regularly, often accompanied by Sage, who had made a full recovery from her wounds and remained as intelligent and loyal as ever. Doc Williams had become something more than a friend. He'd become family, joining Jack for dinner most Sunday evenings and bringing news from town, along with his medical skills. The old physician had documented the health improvements throughout the valley as the water cleared of contamination, creating a medical record that would serve as evidence against anyone who tried similar schemes in other territories. Sheriff Hayes wore his badge with renewed pride, knowing that he'd stood up to corruption when it mattered most. The territorial governor had commended his actions, and there was talk of him running for territorial marshal when the position was officially reopened. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jack himself. The federal marshal's badge once again hung beside his bed, polished and ready for service. He'd been officially reinstated at Samuel's request, with authority to investigate federal crimes throughout the Wyoming Territory. It wasn't a job he'd sought, but it was one he'd accepted with the understanding that some responsibilities couldn't be retired from, they could only be honored or abandoned. The people of Cedar Falls had gradually overcome their fear, returning to the normal rhythms of frontier life. Mrs. Patterson's farm was thriving, her well water tested clean by independent authorities. The Henderson family had recovered from their ordeal, though Tom still kept his children closer to home than he had before. The community had learned that standing together against intimidation was more effective than standing alone in fear. A new photograph sat on Jack's mantelpiece, a group picture taken at the community celebration that had followed Consolidated's defeat. It showed Jack surrounded by the people he'd helped protect: Samuel and Sage, Doc Williams, Sheriff Hayes, the rescued children with their families, and dozens of other townspeople whose lives had been touched by the conspiracy's end. In their faces, Jack saw something that made all the danger and struggle worthwhile: hope for the future and trust in the possibility of justice. The injured horse that had led Samuel to Jack's barn had become a symbol throughout the valley of the loyalty and intelligence that could bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. Children came from miles around to see Sage, and their parents often stayed to hear the story of how one horse's determination had helped save an entire community. Jack still kept Margaret's wedding ring on the chain around his neck, but now it felt less like a burden of grief and more like a blessing of remembered love. He'd learned that honoring her memory didn't require isolation, it required living up to the principles she'd believed in and fighting for the values they'd shared. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and read from Margaret's Bible, the pressed flowers between its pages still bright with the colors of Iowa springs. Her handwritten prayers had taken on new meaning during the fight against Consolidated, and her faith in the power of good people to overcome evil had been vindicated in ways she could never have imagined. The valley had returned to its natural rhythms, but it was stronger now, tempered by trial and united by the shared experience of standing against corruption. The ranchers and farmers who'd once lived in isolation now gathered regularly to share information and support each other. They'd learned that their individual strength was magnified when they stood together for common cause. Jack's ranch remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer his hiding place. Visitors were welcome, and his door was always open to anyone seeking help or justice. He'd discovered that the quiet life he'd sought could coexist with the duties of a lawman, that protecting others didn't require sacrificing personal peace. Samuel visited often, usually bringing reports of other investigations in distant parts of the territory. The network of corruption that Consolidated had revealed was larger than anyone had suspected, but now there were federal marshals working to expose and eliminate it. William Hartwell's death had not been in vain. His son was carrying on the fight with the support of honest lawmen throughout the West. As Jack stood on his porch this particular morning, he saw a familiar figure riding up the trail: Samuel, mounted on Sage, with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his purpose in life. Behind them rode Doc Williams, his medical bag slung across his saddle and a smile creasing his weathered face. "Morning, Jack," Samuel called out as he dismounted. Beautiful day in the valley." "That it is," Jack agreed, stepping down from the porch to greet his friends. "What brings you out this way?" "Thought you might like to know the territorial governor wants to meet with you about establishing a new federal marshal's district headquarters here in Cedar Falls. Seems our little fight has attracted some attention in Washington." Jack considered the implications. A federal marshal's headquarters would bring more responsibility but also more resources to fight corruption throughout the territory. It would mean the end of his quiet retirement, but it would also ensure that what happened with Consolidated could never happen again. "What do you think, Doc?" Jack asked. "Ready to patch up federal marshals on a regular basis?" Doc Williams chuckled. "Son, after patching up you and Samuel through this adventure, I figure I can handle whatever the federal government can throw at me." Sage nickered softly and nudged Jack's shoulder, as if offering her own approval of the plan. The horse had become something of a celebrity throughout the territory, and her intelligence and loyalty had inspired stories that would be told around campfires for generations. Jack looked out over the valley one more time, seeing the clean water running through healthy land, the smoke rising from chimneys where families lived without fear, and the peaceful prosperity that came from honest work fairly rewarded. This was what they'd fought for, not just the defeat of one conspiracy, but the preservation of a way of life that honored both individual freedom and community responsibility. "Tell the governor I'll consider his offer," Jack said finally, "but I have some conditions." Such as this headquarters operates by the principle that protecting the innocent comes before politics, and that federal authority serves the people rather than the other way around. Samuel smiled, the same smile his father had worn when Jack said something that confirmed his faith in human nature. "I think the governor will find those terms acceptable." As his friends prepared to leave, Jack felt a deep satisfaction settling in his chest. The scared, isolated man who'd hidden from responsibility for 15 years was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true peace came not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up for what was right when conflict was inevitable. The sun climbed higher over the Medicine Bow Mountains, casting its light across a valley where justice had triumphed and hope had been restored. In the distance, children played safely in their yards, while their parents worked land that would remain theirs for generations to come. Jack Monroe, federal marshal, protector of the innocent and guardian of the Wyoming Territory, smiled as he watched his friends ride away. Sometimes, the most broken souls did find their way to where they were needed most. Sometimes they discovered that being needed was the greatest blessing of all.